Eddie Howe demanded Newcastle's closed season had to be different after a difficult summer on Tyneside 12 months ago. But is the fog on the Tyne descending around St James's Park again for Newcastle? I'm Ron Walker and welcome to this Newcastle Summer Special podcast. Newcastle fans, this might not be the positive tonic that you're looking for after the distraction of the World Cup, but we'll certainly try to give you some good news. I'm joined by a man who always has his ear close to the ground in the Northeast. It's Sky Sports News' Keith Downie. Keith, has it been nice to have the World Cup to concentrate on, maybe for Newcastle fans as a bit of a distraction and maybe for yourself?
Not if you're Scottish, like me.
Well, I didn't want to mention that, but I mean, at least you were there.
We were there. The fans were good. The football wasn't quite as good as far as Scotland are concerned. But look, that seems to be par for the course for Scotland when they do qualify. I think qualifying is winning for Scotland at the moment. Yeah, look, it's strange with the World Cup, isn't it? Because it feels like it's delayed some transfers. Like we saw what's happened with Morgan Rogers, the moment that England are out. But with others, it's not really played a part. I mean, you look at Anthony Gordon, if we're talking about Newcastle, he wanted his future resolved before it started. Some players are quite happy with the speculation and the noise surrounding them during the World Cup. Others aren't. So it's been a very unusual situation, the World Cup. But it does feel very much like this transfer window, some of the clubs are trying to get their business done early. It feels like, by and large, clubs trying to get their business done earlier because they know that there's probably better value for money. And then, of course, if they manage to get a few players out the door early, it then gives them time to try and add. And look, if you're going to ask me about Newcastle, the one thing they don't want a repeat of last season where the transfer window and everything that went on with it seeped into their season and was, as you rightly say in your intro there, it was a cloud over the club at the start of the season. Absolutely. They want to avoid that. They're trying their best to avoid that. But as they're finding out, there's plenty of hurdles to overcome.
Yes, well, there's plenty of Newcastle transfer questions to ask you during this podcast. But just before we get underway, I did want to obviously touch on the tragic passing of Keegan at the start of this week. Such a legend on and off the pitch around Newcastle. What's the mood been like around the city off the back of that?
You know, it's been sombre. It came as a shock to many people. Of course, we knew that he was battling cancer. That was announced. His family announced that back in January, and then of course it was announced, I think 6-7 weeks ago, that he had stage 4. And look, I think it was, he got admitted to hospital last week, and it went downhill quite quickly afterwards. So it has hit the city hard. It's hit the club hard. We see the outpouring of love and emotion and the tributes and flowers that have been left. I spent some time on Monday at the stadium reading them. It's growing by the hour, growing by the day. It felt very much like every supporter I spoke to who came along to St James's Park to pay their respects had met Keegan at some stage. You know, you don't get many managers like that these days. He was one of the people. He was in amongst them. He was posing for photographs. You know, he opened the training ground up for fans. They used to have thousands of fans coming along to watch training on a daily basis, and they would spend hours posing for photographs and signing autographs afterwards, the days before selfies. And he wanted that connection between the fans and the players to be there. And I spoke to a number of fans who turned up at the ground, and because the tributes were so good and some of the phrases and the words that they said were so strong, I decided to note a few of them down because I thought some of these were just amazing. And this is what a few of the fans who turned up on Monday said to me. He made us believe again. He is the creator of our DNA. Single-handedly, he lifted the club off its knees, not once but twice. Everything Newcastle is today is because of Keegan. He's the most important man in Newcastle's history. Without Kevin, there would be no Alan Shearer, no Sir Bobby, no Champions League nights, literally no Newcastle United. And I was stood between two statues, one of Sir Bobby Robson, one of Alan Shearer, and I said, look, should there be a statue? Said a couple of fans, should there be a statue of Keegan? And one turned around, looked at the stadium, and he said, that stadium behind us, that is Keegan's statue, because he created that, and it's because of him that's there. When he came as a player, there were only a few thousand Newcastle fans going to games. So he saved the club once, and in a second time, he's not from the region. He's from Doncaster, 100 miles south, but he's essentially an adopted Geordie. And I think if you speak to most Newcastle fans, if it was as huge as Sir Bobby Robson and Alan Shearer are, they may feel that he did slightly more for the club. I mean, the three of them are stood high above everyone else, but everyone's got a story to tell, some really funny ones, and they just don't make them like him anymore.
No, a truly special man, and he'll be missed on Tyneside, but also much further afield as well. As I said, we've got a number of questions that have come in from... we put the call out to Newcastle fans, and they have responded. And I'd say maybe a mixed mood, but I think the obvious place to start, and perhaps this is no surprise to you, is with the loss of Sandro Tonali and Anthony Gordon already, and potentially Bruno Guimaraes to follow, how are Newcastle looking to fill in those gaps and that level of experience that they're missing as well?
Yeah, look, the model this year is changed. Look, they were always looking to bring in younger players, by and large, take away the transfer window immediately, the January transfer window immediately after the takeover, when they were bringing in players like Dan Burn and Chris Wood and Matt Targett. Since then, they have been trying to bring in young players and improve them and sell them on at a profit. But the model's changed slightly in that they're now looking at players sort of between the ages of 18 and 24, if they can. And you look at the three players they've signed already, they fall within that bracket. And between 20 million and 40 million pounds, that's the kind of bracket that they're working on now. They will push the boat out for certain players. We saw the club being very close to signing Johan Manzambi from Freiburg. The agreement there was just under 50 million pounds, so that's like a little bit over the 9 million pounds over the 40. They are willing to spend a bit more for certain players, but by and large they're trying to stay within that framework. So the model's changed. They're trying to bring in young players with a high ceiling that they can, one, improve at the club and either sell on a profit, or two, stay with the club for a long time and continue to excel on the pitch. So it's not that different to what we have seen, but it feels like the price tag they're looking at is a little bit cheaper. I asked source at the club, are you trying to be similar to, because it's quite similar to, that sounds, to what Brighton and Brentford do, and they said no, it's more like what Borussia Dortmund do, bring in the young players, improve them, but while also improving the players and selling them on at profit, they also want to be able to compete for honours at the top end of the table. So no mean feat. Remember, the chief executive spoke in March and said we want to be one of the best clubs in Europe by 2030. That's only in 4 years' time. They're going to have to get this ball rolling quickly. I can see why there's a lot of scepticism from the supporters, because they're seeing big name players leave, but at least with that, it's given them a transfer kitty to spend. I just feel they need to get a couple of players in the door just to calm things down a bit. There's a frustration among the fans base at the moment, a disappointment. I think the fans are beginning to question where the project's at the moment. I think a couple of new signings in the door would just keep the tin lid on that a little bit.
Yeah, that does seem to be a lot of faith being put in quite young players if they do want to be pushing on and competing maybe for a Premier League within the next 3 or 4 years, that these guys are not necessarily going to hit the ground running, but they will hit those ceilings in a year or two, and they'll need quite a few of them to do that, I suppose, to be reaching those high levels.
Yeah,
right?
they do. But look, they still want to keep a core element of experience. I'm not saying they want a team of 18 to 24-year-olds. I'm just saying that's the sort of market that they're fishing in. You do have experience there within the squad. Yes, Tonali's gone. Yes, Gordon's gone. Potentially Bruno Guimaraes, but there are experienced players in there. I just think what they'll do is they'll probably try and recycle, for want of a better word, players better, and try maybe not to hold on to them for as long, and sell them when they're at their highest value. So they're trying to bring in young players that they think they've got a high ceiling. You look at last summer's transfer window, it was a disaster for more ways than one. I've touched on it already, for the Isak situation and the cloud hanging over the club, but also the amount of money they spent, and by and large, probably 3, potentially 4 of those players haven't worked out, and they spent £250 million. So at this moment in time, they are trying to make up for the mistakes that were made last year when there was no chief executive, there was no sporting director. Eddie Howe was working essentially with his hands tied behind his back. Yes, mistakes were made. I completely agree, mistakes were made in terms of the recruitment, but it felt very much like all their bad recruitment, and there had not been much since the takeover, very little. It all happened. It all happened at the one time. But you're right, a lot of pressure on these young guys that are coming in. Basu Touri's arrived, £40 million. Sean Stewart, 20 rising to 23. And then the young goalkeeper, Ewan Jouen, who I don't think is going to be the number one. He was 18 million. That just gives you an idea. But I still think they're not ruling out experienced players, but they are trying to bring in more players like that. And we can see it already happening.
That brings me on to one of the other questions, that there has been that desire to bring in those experienced players. I mean, Kieran Trippier may be the first and maybe best example of it when he first came in.
And I was with him yesterday, and I forgot. So I mentioned Dan Burn, Matt Targett and Chris Wood. I forgot the captain, Kieran Trippier. I was with him yesterday. I should have remembered.
He might bring this up with you next time you see him. But on that note, those kind of players, as you say, when they first started recruiting in under this ownership, they were coming in and they seem to be fairly good at recruiting those kind of players. And then we've seen, I think, most explicitly last summer, how much they struggle with that. What's changed? Why are they finding that a little bit more difficult now?
But that wasn't the ownership recruiting those players. Like, the ownership were just saying, look, there you go, there's the money. Like, they were leaving that up to the recruitment team at the football club to do that. So, but you've got to remember, when the takeover happened and Eddie Howe came in the following month, Newcastle were fighting relegation. They didn't need young 18, 19-year-old players coming in. They needed players who were going to help them in a relegation battle. That's why Trippier, Wood, Burn, etc. all arrived, got them out of that. And let's be honest, they've stayed for. Trippier's been there a few years, Burn's been there a few years. They have done a good job. Since that window, they have gone for younger players. So in many ways, it's not really that big a change. It feels like, though, younger players that perhaps we've not heard of too much, like players that are a bit maybe, more obscure. I think, like, I hadn't really heard of Jouen before. I'd heard of Toure, but didn't know much about him. I've not heard of the lad Stewart before. Whereas when they signed Isak and they signed Tonali and they signed Botman, we all knew of them. They were young players and they have improved them. But just going back to the window, yeah, you're right. It was a really poor window last season. But you do look at the previous windows to that, and as I say, the model has always been to try and improve players on the pitch. And you look at the positive recruitment that's been done. Tonali signed for 55, sold for 100. Gordon signed for 40, sold for 70. Isak signed for 63, sold for 125. Premier League transfer. On those three players alone, that's a profit of around about 135 million. So they have been good. It's just, again, I'll repeat myself, it's a shame that all the bad recruitment, and I say bad, the jury is still out. Wissa could have a great season, Elanga could have a great season, Ramsey could have a great season, Voltamad, all or some of those guys could all have a great season coming up, and suddenly that recruitment will look okay, will look good or okay. And you look at Eddie Howe's recruitment in the past, and generally the majority of his players don't really hit the ground running. It takes him a while to get used to his style of play, his intensity. Sometimes it doesn't take as much as a year, but I think the club are hoping that this circuit break at the end of the season, the World Cup, and look at Wissa and Elanga, both did well at the World Cup. I think they're hoping these players are going to come back refreshed, ready to go again, and to coin the phrase that nobody likes hearing, feel like new signings.
Well, you never know. If they do hit the ground running at the start of this season, I think there's a question here about whether Eddie Howe has any impact in what has been potentially struggling to attract some of those bigger names. I think that's in relation specifically to Manzambi, who has turned down Newcastle to go to Aston Villa, but of course they can offer Champions League football aside from anything else. Yeah,
look, I think what's important to recognise here is that Johan Manzambi had agreed to come to Newcastle. He had agreed to personal terms. He was keen on the move. He just preferred Aston Villa. That was nothing against Eddie Howe. That was, from what I'm told, because Aston Villa are a Champions League club next season, and Newcastle aren't. Now, people will say, well, hang on, Newcastle were a Champions League club last summer and they were missing out on Hugo Ekitike and João Pedro and Benjamin Sesko, and they were missing out to Liverpool, Chelsea and Manchester United, like more established, bigger name clubs to players on the continent. Like, they see them as bigger than Newcastle. They still, players like that, and I've said this a number of times, and this is what Newcastle fans, I think, need to accept, and I think they are accepting now. They need to accept that players arriving, Isak, Tonali, even Bruno Guimaraes, they see Newcastle as a stepping stone to them, and they're not seeing. I think maybe when they arrived, they maybe saw it as a potential end point for them, potentially, and they were promised that Newcastle were going to be up fighting. But as the years have ticked by, 4.5, nearly 5 years since the takeover, Newcastle aren't fighting for the title. Newcastle have won just the one trophy, as great as it was. They're not hitting those heady heights. So suddenly guys like Gordon and Tonali and Isak are going, hang on, I've been here 3 years now, 4 years. I want to go and win trophies, and I want to be in Europe. I want to be in the Champions League every year. So it's almost like the project hasn't moved as quickly as what the development of the players has. And that's a lot down to how well Eddie Howe has coached these players and improved them alongside his coaching staff. So going back to your question, the fact Manzambi chose Villa over Newcastle, I'm told, I mean, it was nothing to do with who the manager was. It was to do with, one, they were a Champions League club, and then you have to remember Freiburg played Aston Villa in the final of the Europa League just 6-7 weeks ago. So he'll have seen that outpouring of emotion when Villa won, hammered them in the final, and the fans, and he's probably thought, I'll have a bit of that. That looks good. Newcastle are just another Premier League club to him. He's not seen inside Newcastle. He's seen inside Aston Villa a bit and seen what went on that day. And no doubt someone at the club has had a word in his ear at that point. And I think a combination of those two things has allowed him to pick Villa over Newcastle. Newcastle thought they had a deal done at one point. They were then, after the fee was agreed, I have to say there was a real concern that Villa were there in the background. I was hearing myself that Villa were there. That wasn't getting stood up by colleagues at Sky who cover Aston Villa, so we didn't run the story. And then frustratingly, 3 days later, it broke that Aston Villa were hijacking the deal. But I was aware of that the week before, that Villa were there, they were at the table, they were trying to bring him in. Newcastle were concerned. So I think actually when the news broke that they had hijacked it, I think Newcastle were almost not relaxed about it, but they'd seen it coming.
Yeah.
They'd seen it coming. They'd had their fingers burned with Victor Munoz a couple of weeks previously, which has made everything feel a bit worse. And I think just that general narrative feeds into the fact Newcastle are struggling this window. And look, it hasn't been great, but as I touched on earlier, they beat Real Madrid to Jouen, they beat Brentford to Toure. I think the way Newcastle are looking at it, you win some, you lose some. They just need to win a few more at this moment in time just to calm everyone down a little bit.
I think we can all, inside and out of being Newcastle supporters, see from the outside that they have made some mistakes in the past, let's say, year or two. But does this one, maybe more than anything, come down to the fact that Manzambi just wanted to decide his future after the World Cup and there's not a lot they could do about it?
Yeah, look, he left it open. I was getting told he'll decide his future after World Cup. In all honesty, he probably knew deep down, but was keeping Newcastle, at bay to see what happened with Aston Villa. I think he probably knew, given how quickly it happened after Switzerland exited the World Cup. He probably privately knew, but was saying to everyone else, look, let's just... Because he could have gone and scored a few more goals, and a bigger club than Aston Villa could have come in for him, and he could have chosen that. So he was leaving it open for himself for a strong end to the World Cup. He obviously picked up that injury. But just going back to players picking clubs and clubs losing out, and people keep talking about Newcastle being hijacked again and again. And it did happen last window, as I've mentioned already, for different reasons due to the size and stature of the clubs who were in for Ekitike and João Pedro and Sesko and Mbumo, etc. This time, it's the Champions League. They've lost out to Villa, and then they've lost out to Liverpool for Victor Munoz. Both those clubs in the Champions League. Yeah. But you look at other clubs as well. Right? No one's calling Arsenal hijacked FC because they've lost out on Morgan Rogers, who I think everyone thought was going to go there, and Chelsea have come in last minute.
Yeah.
I think it's really easy for clubs and fans to put a label on their club and get themselves overly emotionally sort of down about things. Look, you ask Newcastle, they're not down about it. They're disappointed they missed out on the players, but they're not low. They think they can go again. They're trying to improve, and they have other targets. And I'm told that they're in talks with a number of players at the moment. Your next question is who those are. Sadly, I don't know.
Let me ask you about some positions. That might be a little bit easier. Are there any? I'm assuming midfield would be the obvious one, with Guimaraes potentially on his way out and Tonali already gone.
Yeah, they need another midfielder. If Guimaraes goes, potentially two.
So Willock potentially on his way out as well?
Yeah, he's one that I would expect to leave this window. I think there's probably question marks still about Harvey Barnes, whether he stays. I know there's some interest from Aston Villa. Of course, Bruno's the big one. Nick Pope. There's a few players who've been there for a number of years now who probably their time at the club's coming to an end. The priority right now is bringing in a goalkeeper and a full-back who can play either side. So they want to bring in. So they've got Tino Livramento who can do that. They're keen to tie him down to a new deal. Nothing's been agreed as of yet, but... there was interest in him in this window. That appears to have cooled, I think mainly due to the injuries he's picked up. Maybe a couple of clubs have maybe just cooled their interest a little bit. So they want to bring a fullback, they want to bring goalkeeper, they would like to bring at least one midfielder. And then if Jacob Murphy goes, I reported last week that Everton are interested in him. If Jacob Murphy does go, that would then open up a slot to bring in another right winger as well. I think they'll go with the strikers they've got unless one goes. And I look at who they've got. I don't see Osula going. I don't see Voltemad going. Wissa, I think there's a slight chance if someone comes in and makes a decent offer for him, there is a chance, in which case they would obviously look to bring in a replacement there. I'm missing someone striker wise, haven't I? Obviously Gordon's away now, but yeah, I think they'll probably go with I think they'll probably go with what they've got in the striking department, unless one goes. So, but look, I remember sitting here this time last year talking about numbers and positions, and then things changed massively when like Isak went, and so it is a very fluid situation.
Is that something they're keen to avoid this year? Because otherwise you could end up with that Bruno Guimaraes saga, or has already become a saga in a sense, and you don't want to be sat here at the last week of the transfer window going, right, we've got to replace him at the last minute for such a crucial player, as you did with Alexander Isak 12 months ago.
Yeah, that bled into the season. I don't think it'll happen again. And they're keen to, if players do want to leave, and they've made it clear they want to leave, they'll try and get a deal done and maximise the value to them, maximise what I mean, look at Tonali, for example. He kind of said, look, I'm ready for a change. I want to move on. I think part of the attraction was London, part of the attraction was Roberto De Zerbi as compatriot, and probably financial as well. Those are probably the three main reasons. So they said, okay, you want to go, like, we will let you go, but only once we extract maximum value, and they feel that they got that in the 192 plus £8 million offer from Tottenham. Similar with Gordon, it was a very quick, simple process. And I think most Newcastle fans are probably happy with the 70. Look, I think you speak to any Newcastle fan, 100 for Tonali and 70 for Gordon. I think they're happy with that business, but it just makes the squad feel a lot lighter. But the other issue you've got is when you sell players early in the transfer window, as good as it is for transactional reasons, and it allows you to then, what clubs then know is you've got money in your back pocket to spend, and then there's a bit of a tax put on top of it. So there's arguments for selling early and arguments for selling it, but I think they got their fingers burned massively last summer with Isak's situation, panicking at the end of the window, bringing in Wissa and Voltamad, with hours to go of the window, and they don't want that to overpaying for players as well. They don't want that to happen again, so they just feel getting their ducks in order early gives them a much better chance, and that's why I don't see the Bruno Guimaraes thing dragging on. I think if he is to go to Arsenal, Newcastle would prefer it's done earlier. They do not want to sell, though. They're desperate to keep him here. If Arsenal finally come to the table, which they haven't done yet, they've not made an official bid, if Arsenal do come to the table and make an acceptable offer to Newcastle, and I think that would be at least beginning with an 8, I think Newcastle there would be a decision to make. I think they've got a problem. I think if Arsenal come to the table and offer £85 million, Bruno's already said he'd like to explore an opportunity to Arsenal, I think they've got a decision. But if the numbers they're discussing are 50, 60, I'm saying they're discussing, Arsenal haven't even spoken to Newcastle, but indirectly through intermediaries, if it's 50, 60, there's no deal. There's no deal. It's going to have to be significantly higher for Newcastle to sit up and take notice. They do not want to lose him, but once a player has told the club he wants to go, and if a big offer comes in, it's really hard to stop that happening.
We will see. Big couple of weeks ahead potentially for Newcastle and Bruno Guimaraes. I mean, as covering Newcastle, you must be very au fait with spreadsheets and the work of PSR over the last few years, and how that's affected Newcastle's work in the transfer window. And also now there's that UEFA ruling on Newcastle spending last season and breaches regarding that. How much impact does that have on their ability to spend this summer?
Well, look, I think the UEFA sanction essentially was a problem, but I think we're seeing the result of that in what they're doing this window. Gordon going early, it almost felt like they had to essentially sell before they could buy. They needed to show that they were staying in line with that. I mean, look, Newcastle have been on the verge of it for a couple of seasons now. We saw them selling Elliot Anderson 2 years ago for essentially peanuts. Yes, it was
touchy subject.
Yeah, I mean, look, I know it's £35 million, but Newcastle were forced to take a goalkeeper that they didn't want. Yeah. In return, I think it was about £17 or £18 million. So they essentially sold they sold Anderson for £80 million. For £18 million. And I remember Newcastle fans at the time thinking, 35, that's actually good value, 35. They didn't know they were having to take this goalkeeper as part of it at the time. And also, we didn't know that within 2 years he's going to be going to Man City for £116 million, and there was no clause in there for Newcastle to get a slice of that. Really bad business, but that was because they were up against the black ball. They were really up against it with regards to PSR. Look, I'm told that they are desperate to do everything above board, and they already are, which is why we see them selling players. But Newcastle's way around this is to improve the commercial revenue coming into the club. That's the one thing I could criticise PIF for. a bit is the fact that, look, they've spent everything they can in terms of outlay on players. They've pretty much, as I say, they've chucked everything at it. Everything the club have asked for, the recruitment team have asked for, the managers asked for, they've got in terms of buying players, and they've maxed that out. But what they could do is they could improve things commercially at the club. They're still playing at St James's Park. I think a lot of players arriving would have expected to have seen progress on a new stadium by now. They're still at the same training ground, and yes, at least 10, maybe 15 million pounds gone in to improve that. But it's nothing like what we see at Tottenham or Carrington or Leicester in League One. It's nothing like that, and I think that probably doesn't help attract players to the club. And then just generally commercially at the club, yes, it's improving year on year. The commercial revenue is improving, but probably at not a fast enough rate to be able to then fish in the same transfer waters as a Tottenham, as a Manchester United, as an Arsenal, as a Liverpool, and we've seen that, and that's why they're, one, missing out on players to these clubs, and two, losing their players, i.e. Tonali. People are saying, how are Tottenham funding Sandro Tonali? How are they managing that? Well, the reason is their commercial revenue is almost double that of what Newcastle's are, so it gives them a massive head start. So that's where the PIF need to improve, and I would say that's been the case since they arrived. It feels like by and large they've got things right, and they've spent as much as they can on the pitch. They need to do better off the pitch to get Newcastle up there competing with the top dogs.
For this summer at least, if they do lose Guimaraes, that would be, I think, about 250 million on 3 players incoming. Does that at least ease the purse strings a little bit in terms of what they want to bring in?
Absolutely, yeah, and it gives them freedom to go there, to go and spend. But again, and I've touched on it already, it then alerts other clubs that they do have money to spend, and that's something they've battled with since the takeover. There was always this Newcastle tax put on things because they thought, the richest owners in the world, and that's great. They are the richest owners in the world, but only if they're allowed to spend the money. And if they're not allowed to spend it, then they're unable to do that. But yeah, it does give them more freedom to go and spend. Does it make any easier to sign players? Well, we're showing that that's not the case because they've missed out on a couple already. But at least they're not right up against it financially. At least they've got more freedom to go and spend. And I'm really interested to see what they do between now and the end of the window. But I just feel they need to get I've said it already, they need to get a couple of players in quickly because after the Manzambi deal fell through, I think if there was another one lined up, it wouldn't have felt so bad. But that's now been nearly about a week and a half, 2 weeks since that fell through, and have not added anyone. And I can just feel like the supporters getting restless. I mean, the players are coming back for pre-season now. Eddie Howe wants them in early. You don't want to be bringing players in the last couple of days of the window. You want to make sure they get a good pre-season under the belts. Well, they need to start bringing a couple in early because the squad's looking a little bit thin on the ground.
Well, certainly never dull following Newcastle, certainly never dull covering Newcastle as well, I'm sure.
Mate, no.
Heath, thank you so much for coming down and joining us. You can follow everything across Newcastle's pre-season, the rest of the transfer window, and of course the Premier League season kicking off against Liverpool on August the 23rd, live on Sky Sports. And you can follow everything from Newcastle on the Sky Sports app, on our digital platforms, and of course on Sky Sports News.